The sun was setting, casting a golden hue across the city streets as Mr. Daniels made his way to the luxury car dealership. At first glance, he seemed like any other elderly man, stooped with age, dressed in a threadbare brown coat that had seen better days, and a hat that looked as though it had weathered many seasons. His clothes told the story of a man who had lived a simple life, modest and unassuming. But the reality was far more complex. Mr. Daniels was, in fact, one of the wealthiest men in the city. He had made his fortune in real estate, growing a modest investment into an empire over decades of hard work. However, his wealth had never defined him. He was a man of humility, uninterested in flaunting his success, and instead preferred to blend in with the crowd. As he approached the dealership, he took in the pristine glass windows that displayed the latest models of luxury cars, their sleek exteriors gleaming under the artificial lights of the showroom. He had always had a passion for cars, and now, with his fortune secured, he decided to reward himself with a new purchase. He pushed open the glass door and stepped inside. The contrast between Mr. Daniels and the opulence of the showroom was stark. The floors were polished marble, and the walls were lined with chrome accents and large posters featuring shiny, futuristic vehicles. The dealership was a place designed to impress, to cater to those who could afford to spend without hesitation. But as Mr. Daniels walked in, heads turned, though not in admiration. Bradley, the lead salesman, was the first to notice him. Dressed in an immaculate black suit, his hair slicked back, and a smirk permanently etched on his face, Bradley took one look at Mr. Daniels and instantly dismissed him. He leaned against one of the expensive cars, his eyes scanning Mr. Daniels up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Can I help you?" Bradley asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Mr. Daniels smiled warmly. "Yes, I was hoping to take a look at some of your vehicles. I'm in the market for something new." Bradley raised an eyebrow, trying to suppress a chuckle. "Are you now? Well, I'm afraid we only deal with serious buyers here." Mr. Daniels' smile didn't falter. He was used to being underestimated. "I understand. I'd still like to take a look around if that's all right." Bradley exchanged a glance with one of his colleagues, who had also noticed the elderly man and was now watching with amusement. "Sure," Bradley said, stepping aside with a theatrical flourish. "But these aren't exactly budget-friendly cars. I wouldn't want you to waste your time." Mr. Daniels nodded, his eyes scanning the showroom, taking in the cars that lined the space. He approached a sleek, jet-black sports car, its exterior flawless and reflective under the lights. As he gently ran his hand along the car's side, he could feel Bradley's eyes on him, watching, judging. "Nice car," Mr. Daniels said, more to himself than to Bradley. "Yeah, well," Bradley said with a smirk, "it's probably a little out of your price range. Why don't you try one of the dealerships down the road? They might have something more suitable." The insult hung in the air, but Mr. Daniels didn't react. Instead, he took a moment to admire the car before turning back to Bradley. "I'll think about it," he said softly, nodding. "Thank you for your time." With that, Mr. Daniels turned and made his way toward the door. As he walked past the other salespeople, he could hear the faint sound of laughter behind him. They were mocking him, their voices low but unmistakable. "Did you see his coat?" one of them whispered. "Looks like he hasn't bought new clothes in years." "Probably came here by mistake," another said. "He doesn't belong here." Mr. Daniels pushed the glass door open and stepped outside. The cool evening air hit his face, and for a moment, he stood still, letting the sounds of the city wash over him. He wasn't angry, nor was he offended. He had seen this kind of behavior many times before. People who judged others by their appearance, by the way they dressed or spoke. He had built his entire fortune by staying grounded, by not letting the opinions of others affect him. And he wasn't about to start now. But as he walked away from the dealership, something stirred inside him. A quiet resolve began to form. He knew exactly what he was going to do next. The heavy glass door of the dealership swung shut behind Mr. Daniels with a soft click. As he walked further into the showroom, the faint smell of leather, polish, and something faintly metallic filled the air. Everything about the dealership screamed luxury, from the gleaming marble floors to the perfectly lit show cars that were spaced like precious jewels in a museum. This was a place for the wealthy, a playground for those who lived life at the highest tier. Mr. Daniels walked slowly, his cane tapping lightly against the floor, his eyes drawn to the sleek vehicles on display. He wasn't in a rush. After all, when you had lived as long as he had and seen what he had seen, time felt different. He approached a deep blue luxury sedan, its paint so flawless it looked like a smooth, glassy lake. The price tag was discreetly placed on the windshield, but he didn't need to look at it. He knew cars like these could cost more than most people made in a year. But that wasn't a problem for him. Money had never been a problem for him. He turned his head slightly, noticing that none of the salespeople had approached him yet. There were at least 4 staff members on the floor, 2 of them standing behind a sleek counter, typing on their computers. Bradley, the same salesman who had initially dismissed him, was now leaning against a red convertible, idly talking to one of his colleagues. He glanced over at Mr. Daniels, his expression one of amusement, then quickly turned back to his conversation. Mr. Daniels didn't mind. He had always preferred to observe rather than be the center of attention. But as the minutes passed, it became increasingly clear that no one had any intention of helping him. He circled the blue sedan, running his hand along its perfectly crafted surface, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingers. He looked over again at Bradley, hoping to catch his eye, but the young man was deliberately ignoring him. Finally, with a soft sigh, Mr. Daniels walked over toward the counter where 2 other salespeople were chatting. As he approached, they glanced at him, exchanged a quick look, then resumed their conversation as though he weren't even there. He stood patiently, waiting for them to acknowledge him, but they carried on as though his presence was irrelevant. Clearing his throat gently, Mr. Daniels spoke up. "Excuse me, I was wondering if you could assist me. I'm interested in purchasing one of your vehicles." The younger of the 2 salesmen, a man in his late 20s with slicked back hair and a smug smile, barely looked up. "Sure, we'll be with you in a minute," he muttered dismissively, his voice oozing with insincerity. Mr. Daniels waited a moment longer, hoping they would take him seriously. But they continued chatting among themselves, laughing quietly as though sharing some private joke. Frustration simmered beneath his calm exterior, but he refused to let it show. He had spent a lifetime keeping his emotions in check, always maintaining composure in the face of adversity. With a nod, he turned and walked back toward the front of the dealership, feeling the weight of their mocking stares on his back. As he passed Bradley, the salesman smirked openly, crossing his arms over his chest. "Hey, old man," Bradley called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You sure you're in the right place? We don't really deal with, window shoppers." A couple of his colleagues laughed quietly, shaking their heads. Bradley continued, enjoying the attention. "Maybe you should try down the street. I'm sure there's a second-hand shop more your speed." For a moment, the room fell silent, and all eyes were on Mr. Daniels. The insult hung in the air, thick and heavy like smoke. Mr. Daniels paused, his hand resting on the handle of the glass door. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the urge to respond, to put this arrogant young man in his place. But instead, he took a deep breath, calming the fire inside him. With slow, deliberate movements, he turned around, meeting Bradley's mocking gaze. His eyes were steady, and his voice, though soft, carried weight. "You shouldn't judge people based on their appearance, son," he said quietly. "You never know who you're talking to." Bradley's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure, dismissing the old man's words with a shrug. "Whatever you say, old-timer." Mr. Daniels didn't say another word. He simply nodded, turned, and pushed the glass door open. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, he could hear the faint sound of laughter behind him. The sales staff were laughing at him, mocking him. The image of them snickering at his back was burned into his mind. But there was no anger in him, no bitterness. He had dealt with far worse in his lifetime. Walking slowly back to his car, a classic yet modest-looking vehicle that was parked a block away, Mr. Daniels reflected on what had just happened. He wasn't hurt by their treatment. He had grown accustomed to people underestimating him. What amused him most was how easily people fell into the trap of assuming that money always wore fancy clothes, expensive watches, and designer shoes. But he had a surprise in store for them. As he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, Mr. Daniels smiled to himself, a small, knowing smile. He had a plan, and it would unfold in due time. He glanced once more at the sleek cars lining the dealership's windows, knowing that in a few minutes, everything inside that showroom was about to change. After Mr. Daniels left the dealership, a certain uneasy quietness hung in the air. Bradley, who had been so smug and dismissive, now stood at the edge of the showroom, fiddling with his phone and occasionally glancing out of the window. The rest of the staff, still lingering near their desks, had moved on to other matters, chatting among themselves and discussing potential customers they thought would walk in later. Just as Bradley was about to head back to his desk, the quietness was shattered by the low rumbling sound of engines, a sound unlike anything the staff had heard all day. One by one, luxury cars began pulling up in front of the dealership. Sleek, powerful, and gleaming under the afternoon sun, each car was a testament to craftsmanship and wealth. First came a deep black Bentley, followed by a snow-white Rolls-Royce, and then, in quick succession, a bright yellow Lamborghini, a sleek silver Porsche, and a royal blue Bugatti. Bradley stared through the enormous glass windows of the dealership, his eyes widening in disbelief. The other staff quickly followed suit, their chatter dying down as they realized something extraordinary was happening. The sound of high-end engines revving in perfect synchrony filled the air as the luxury cars formed a neat row in front of the dealership, like kings arriving for a royal procession. Inside the showroom, the atmosphere shifted from idle boredom to tense curiosity. The cars, each more expensive than the last, were the kind of vehicles that the dealership rarely sold, despite having them in their collection. The sales staff watched with stunned silence as the drivers of these cars stepped out, all impeccably dressed, some in tailored suits and others in sleek designer attire. They moved with purpose, glancing toward the dealership as though waiting for something or someone. The front door of the Bentley opened last, and out stepped Mr. Daniels. Only now he was not the humble old man in worn clothes who had walked into the dealership just minutes ago. This time, he was dressed in a sharp, tailored navy blue suit that fit him perfectly. His cane, once a symbol of his age, now seemed like an accessory that only added to his stately presence. Behind him, a young, well-dressed personal assistant quickly followed, holding a leather briefcase in one hand and a tablet in the other. She moved briskly, but with grace, clearly accustomed to handling high-profile clients. Bradley's jaw dropped, and the other staff were similarly frozen in place, their earlier laughter and arrogance wiped away in an instant. They could barely believe what they were seeing. This was the same man they had mocked, the man they had assumed was just an old window shopper. And now he was returning with an entourage of luxury cars that made their own showroom inventory look like mere playthings. The dealership door opened with a soft whoosh, and Mr. Daniels stepped inside, his personal assistant just a few steps behind him. The air in the room felt different, charged with tension, awe, and a palpable sense of shock. Bradley was the first to snap out of his daze, rushing forward with a nervous smile plastered on his face. Mr. Daniels, I didn't realize," Bradley stammered, suddenly struggling to find his words. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced with a look of anxious regret. Mr. Daniels, however, barely acknowledged him. He walked past Bradley as though he didn't exist, his eyes sweeping over the cars in the showroom with a look of mild interest. It was as though the earlier insults and dismissals had never happened. He had nothing to prove and no need for petty vengeance. His presence alone was enough to send a clear message. One of the other salespeople, Lisa, a woman in her early 30s, who had not laughed but had also not spoken up earlier, approached cautiously. "Is there anything I can assist you with, Mr. Daniels?" she asked, her voice polite but tinged with fear. She could sense that the power dynamic in the room had shifted drastically. Mr. Daniels turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. "I'm interested in purchasing one of your more exclusive models," he said simply, his voice calm and measured. Lisa blinked in surprise, then quickly nodded. "Of course, sir. I'll show you our top-of-the-line collection. Right this way." Bradley hovered in the background, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. He had never felt so small, so insignificant. Just moments ago, he had been the one in control, the one who had belittled Mr. Daniels. Now he was watching as the very man he had ridiculed was about to make the biggest purchase the dealership had seen in years. As Mr. Daniels and his assistant followed Lisa toward the exclusive section of the showroom, the other sales staff whispered among themselves, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding before them. No one could believe it. This man, this quiet, unassuming man, was a millionaire. And not just any millionaire, but one who clearly had the power and influence to command an entourage of luxury vehicles, personal assistants, and no doubt more wealth than anyone in that dealership could fathom. Lisa led Mr. Daniels to a platinum-colored sports car, the most expensive model in the entire showroom. The car was a masterpiece of engineering, with custom features that made it one of a kind. As they approached, Lisa's hands trembled slightly as she prepared to give her sales pitch. But before she could speak, Mr. Daniels held up his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "I'll take it," he said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Lisa blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "You'll take it?" she repeated just to be sure. Mr. Daniels nodded once. "Yes, I'll also need it delivered to my residence by this evening. My assistant will handle the payment and delivery details." He gestured to his assistant, who stepped forward with the briefcase in hand. Lisa stood there, stunned, as the assistant began arranging the paperwork with precision and efficiency. Meanwhile, Mr. Daniels turned and took one last glance at Bradley, who was still standing frozen in the background. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that single look, Mr. Daniels conveyed everything he needed to. Without a word, Mr. Daniels turned and walked out of the dealership, his assistant following close behind. The luxury cars that had arrived with him slowly pulled away, one by one, leaving the dealership staff in stunned silence. Bradley remained where he stood, his mind racing with the realization of what had just happened. The dealership, moments ago a place of mocking laughter, was now filled with an undeniable sense of awe and regret. Mr. Daniels had taught them all a lesson that would linger long after he was gone. The atmosphere in the dealership had shifted drastically. A heavy, awkward silence filled the space as Mr. Daniels left the building, the sound of the luxurious engines fading into the distance. The dealership staff stood in stunned disbelief, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. For Bradley, however, the realization of his actions hit him the hardest. Moments ago, Bradley had been the king of his world, a confident, arrogant salesman who believed he could judge anyone by their outward appearance. Now he stood frozen near the entrance, the color drained from his face, feeling more like a fool than ever before. He had been so dismissive of the elderly man, dressed in worn, faded clothes, never once suspecting that this was one of the wealthiest men in the city. The rest of the staff exchanged nervous glances, whispering among themselves. Some pretended to busy themselves with paperwork or phone calls, while others glanced toward Bradley, hoping he would make the first move. Everyone knew they had just made a colossal mistake, but no one knew how to fix it. Bradley swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing as he imagined the repercussions. His mind raced with thoughts of his career, his reputation, and the possible fallout from what he had just done. He could hardly believe how quickly his smug arrogance had crumbled into shame. His heart pounded in his chest as he finally broke free from his daze and rushed to the back office, where the dealership manager, Mr. Evans, sat reviewing sales reports. Bursting into the office, Bradley's voice was shaky. "Mr. Evans, we need to fix this. You won't believe what just happened," he stammered, his words tumbling out in a rush. Mr. Evans, an older, stern man with gray hair and a reputation for being a shrewd businessman, looked up from his papers, raising an eyebrow. "What are you talking about, Bradley? What's going on?" he asked, clearly irritated by the interruption. Bradley ran a hand through his hair, pacing nervously. "That old man who came in, the one I turned away, he's a millionaire. He just pulled up in a fleet of luxury cars and bought the most expensive car we have. I didn't realize who he was." Bradley's voice cracked, his face flushed with a mix of panic and embarrassment. Mr. Evans's eyes widened in shock. "A millionaire?" he repeated, slowly rising from his chair. His expression darkened as the gravity of the situation sank in. "You turned away a millionaire?" Bradley nodded, his hands shaking. "I didn't know. He didn't look like someone who could afford—" Mr. Evans cut him off with a sharp glare. "It doesn't matter what he looked like. You should treat every customer with respect, no matter what. I taught you better than this, Bradley." Bradley stood there, his mouth dry, unable to respond. His mind replayed the scene over and over, Mr. Daniels walking in, being dismissed, and then returning in grand fashion to prove everyone wrong. The humiliation of it all weighed heavily on him. Meanwhile, in the main showroom, the staff were still buzzing with disbelief. They gathered around in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, their earlier confidence replaced by nervous chatter. Some were checking their phones, Googling Mr. Daniels' name, and quickly learning just how powerful and influential he was. Before long, Mr. Evans stormed out of his office, his face flushed with anger. He marched toward the front desk, calling for the staff to gather around. Bradley followed behind, his head hanging low, dreading the inevitable fallout. "We need to make this right," Mr. Evans began, addressing the staff. "Mr. Daniels is one of the wealthiest men in this city, and he was treated with utter disrespect in this showroom today. I don't care what someone looks like or how they're dressed. Every customer deserves our full attention. This kind of behavior will not be tolerated." The staff nodded in agreement, looking sheepish. Some had been involved in mocking Mr. Daniels earlier, while others had simply stood by and done nothing. Now, guilt weighed heavily on all of them. Bradley, feeling the pressure mounting, stepped forward. His voice was quiet, almost pleading. "Mr. Evans, I'll apologize to him personally. I'll fix this." Just as the conversation continued, the sleek glass doors of the dealership opened once again. To everyone's surprise, Mr. Daniels walked back in, this time without his entourage. He moved with the same calm grace as before, his face composed and unreadable. Mr. Evans hurried toward him, extending his hand in greeting. "Mr. Daniels, please, let me extend my sincerest apologies on behalf of my staff. We didn't realize who you were. This behavior is unacceptable, and I assure you it won't happen again." Mr. Daniels looked at Mr. Evans for a moment, then glanced at Bradley, whose face was pale and tense. The elderly millionaire's eyes softened slightly, and he gave a small nod of acknowledgement, but he did not take Mr. Evans's hand. "Thank you for your apology," Mr. Daniels said in a quiet, steady voice. "But the issue isn't about who I am or how much money I have. The issue is how your staff treats people, any people, who walk through these doors." Mr. Evans nodded quickly, his face flushed with embarrassment. "You're absolutely right, sir. We'll make sure to improve our customer service going forward." Bradley, sensing this was his moment, stepped forward. "Mr. Daniels, I am deeply sorry for the way I treated you earlier. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. I didn't realize who you were, but that's no excuse. Please accept my apology." Mr. Daniels turned to Bradley, his expression calm but firm. "I appreciate your apology, Bradley, but remember this. It's not about realizing who someone is. It's about treating everyone with respect, regardless of what they look like or how they're dressed. That's the real lesson here." Bradley lowered his head, feeling the weight of Mr. Daniels' words. He nodded in agreement, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sir. I understand." Mr. Daniels took a deep breath, glancing around at the staff who were now gathered near the front of the showroom, all watching with nervous anticipation. "I don't need revenge or special treatment," he said. "What I hope is that all of you have learned something today. Judging someone by their appearance will only lead to regret. Kindness, respect, and humility go a long way." With that, Mr. Daniels gave a small, polite nod to the group, then turned and walked out of the dealership once more, leaving behind a room full of humbled staff members. The silence that followed was heavy with guilt and reflection. Bradley stood still, staring at the floor, replaying Mr. Daniels' words in his head. His heart pounded with a mixture of shame and gratitude. Shame for his actions and gratitude for the lesson he had been taught. Mr. Evans turned to the staff, his voice stern but calm. "Let this be a lesson to all of us," he said. "We treat every customer with respect from now on. No exceptions." The staff nodded in agreement, their earlier arrogance replaced with humility. They had all been humbled by the quiet dignity of the unassuming millionaire they had mistreated, and it was a lesson they would not forget. The day had taken an unexpected turn at the luxury dealership, one that no one could have anticipated. After the initial chaos of Mr. Daniels' return and the staff's scramble to apologize, there was a tense stillness that settled over the showroom. Every eye followed Mr. Daniels as he moved with quiet confidence toward the car he had chosen, the most expensive one in the dealership. Even then, there was no arrogance in his demeanor, no hint of revenge in his actions. He simply made his decision, as if the events that had just unfolded were of no consequence to him. The luxury car gleamed under the lights, its sleek design a perfect reflection of elegance and power. Mr. Daniels nodded to his personal assistant, who spoke briefly with the manager to finalize the paperwork. Despite the earlier disrespect, Mr. Daniels made no demands for special treatment. He could have humiliated the staff, used his wealth to make a statement, but instead he let his actions speak louder than any words of retaliation ever could. Bradley, who had been the most outspoken in dismissing Mr. Daniels earlier, stood to the side, still feeling the sting of shame. His chest felt tight as he watched Mr. Daniels calmly inspect the car one last time. The elderly millionaire's words echoed in his mind. "It's not about who you are, it's about how you treat people." Bradley swallowed hard, knowing that lesson would stay with him forever. It was a bitter pill to swallow, realizing that in his arrogance, he had lost sight of the basic decency owed to every human being. Mr. Evans, the dealership manager, approached cautiously, still trying to smooth over the situation. "Mr. Daniels," he began, his tone respectful and cautious, "I just want to express again how deeply sorry we are for what happened earlier. I hope this doesn't affect your experience with us going forward." Mr. Daniels turned to face Mr. Evans, his expression thoughtful but calm. "Mr. Evans, I've been in business long enough to know that mistakes happen. I don't hold grudges. But as I told your staff, this is about respect, not just for customers like me, but for everyone who walks through your doors." Mr. Evans nodded, visibly relieved that Mr. Daniels wasn't the type of man to make this incident any worse than it already was. "You're absolutely right, sir. We've all learned a valuable lesson today." Satisfied with the manager's response, Mr. Daniels turned back toward his car, running a hand along its pristine surface. His assistant handed him the keys, and for a moment, there was a palpable tension in the air. Everyone knew that when Mr. Daniels drove away, he would leave behind more than just an expensive purchase. He would leave behind a story, one that would travel far beyond the walls of this dealership. As Mr. Daniels climbed into the driver's seat, a few of the remaining staff members stepped forward, watching in awe. Even though their earlier mockery and arrogance had vanished, they still couldn't quite believe what had happened. The millionaire who had walked into their showroom in worn clothes and been insulted had chosen not to seek revenge, but instead had given them a lesson they would never forget. The engine of the luxury car roared to life, a deep, powerful sound that reverberated through the dealership. Mr. Daniels adjusted his seat, placed his hands on the steering wheel, and for a moment looked out across the showroom. His eyes lingered on Bradley for just a second, a quiet acknowledgement of the lesson he had taught the young salesman. Bradley, feeling the weight of that gaze, nodded slightly in return, grateful for the opportunity to learn from his mistake. With a final nod to his assistant, Mr. Daniels eased the car forward, the sleek vehicle gliding effortlessly out of the dealership. As he drove off, the sunlight reflecting off the polished exterior, the staff watched in stunned silence. The once dismissive staff members, who had been so quick to judge, now stood humbled and ashamed. The news of the incident spread rapidly. Within hours, it was the talk of the town. Social media lit up with stories about the humble millionaire who had walked into a luxury dealership in simple clothes and purchased the most expensive car on the lot after being insulted. Comments flooded in, with people praising Mr. Daniels for his quiet dignity and his ability to rise above the pettiness of those who had judged him. "Never judge a book by its cover," one user wrote. "A true gentleman. That's how you teach a lesson without being cruel," another commented. It wasn't long before news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a lesson in humility and respect. The headlines ranged from "Millionaire teaches luxury dealership a valuable lesson" to "Wealthy man's humble act goes viral." The narrative was clear. Respect should be given freely, not based on appearances or assumptions about wealth or status. For Mr. Daniels, the incident was just another day. He wasn't interested in the viral fame or the sudden surge of attention. To him, it was simply about treating people with decency, something he had lived by his entire life. He didn't need the recognition, nor did he crave it. His wealth had never defined him, and he had never allowed it to affect how he treated others. Meanwhile, back at the dealership, the staff gathered for an emergency meeting. Mr. Evans stood before them, his face stern but reflective. What happened today is a reminder for all of us. We're in the business of selling luxury, but that doesn't mean we only respect people who look like they can afford it. Every person who walks through these doors deserves our full attention and respect. Bradley, still shaken by the day's events, raised his hand. His voice was quieter than usual, lacking the bravado he once carried. I just want to say, I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I treated Mr. Daniels like he wasn't worth my time because of the way he looked. But I've learned my lesson. I won't make that mistake again. The rest of the staff murmured their agreement, nodding in understanding. It wasn't just Bradley who had learned a lesson that day. They all had. As days passed, the dealership made significant changes. Mr. Evans implemented new customer service training, ensuring that every staff member treated customers with the respect they deserved, regardless of their appearance or perceived status. The lesson Mr. Daniels had imparted left a lasting impact, not just on the dealership, but on everyone who heard the story. For Mr. Daniels, life continued as usual. He went about his business, always humble, always grounded. The viral fame faded as quickly as it had come, but the impact of his actions lingered in the minds of those who witnessed it. His quiet lesson in respect served as a reminder to never judge others based on outward appearances and to always treat people with kindness, no matter their station in life. And as he drove through the city in his luxury car, passing by the very dealership that had once dismissed him, he couldn't help but smile. Not because of the car or the wealth he had, but because he knew he had made a difference, not just in the lives of the dealership staff, but in the minds of everyone who heard his story. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the story and share any themes or ideas you'd like to hear in future stories. Your feedback means the world to me. Thanks for watching.